Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Same as usual for those that have been on before. If you want to just say hello in the chat, that would be wonderful, and let us know where you're coming from. That would be absolutely brilliant, and we'll leave it about a minute before we actually get started. Quick introductions then. I'm Andy Sanford from We Are Lean and Agile. We do continuous improvement and software to help organizations implement it. And we have again Lenny. So I'll let Lenny introduce herself.
Hello, everybody. Yes, sorry, I was a bit behind myself there, but nice to see familiar names again. So it's great that a few of you have kind of come back for more and more of these sessions. I guess that bodes well. And a few new names, which is always brilliant. It's always nice to see new people. So hopefully you will get plenty out of it. Bit of a kind of packed session today, so I'm going to try and get through as much as we can. But for those of you that haven't met before, my name is Lenny Bedian. I am the director and owner of BW Training. We are a soft skills company, so we do a lot of work around behaviour and culture change and kind of organisational development stuff. So yeah, that's me.
Brilliant. Okay, so I think, as I recall, we're going to kick straight into a poll. So let's just see how people are doing today. Same old poll as usual, but it's good to gauge the spirit in the room after the weekends.
Don't say it.
I want to say comings and goings. I've got to say that. You know?
I knew it was going to happen at some point, to be fair.
Yeah, well, we'll just leave that there. You know, I need to pop out afterwards and just take a 40-minute drive, test my eyesight.
Lots of happies today, which is fantastic. A couple of meh, but loads of happy. That's great. The coach in me, the curious person in me, wants to understand what's happening for you all, that you're all happy. But I do wonder, actually, I've been doing a lot of reading around kind of, again, it links very much to change management, which most of you will remember we did the model on, how we sort of get used to a new set of circumstances. And I wonder, 2 months in, we're quite a way into it now, whether you've just kind of got your routine now, you know what you're doing, you're more comfortable perhaps with what you're doing. For me, the bigger challenge is going to be, as we start to come out the other end of this, how do I get back into that kind of work mindset and what will work look like? So definitely a product. No homeschooling. That's what it is. No homeschooling this week. I bet every parent who's watching this is going, yes, that's the reason. That's literally the reason. Definitely some reintegration, I think. So great to see that people are happy. That's fantastic. Good to know.
Excellent. So same format as always. We're going to introduce a couple of polls. Obviously, please do interact in the chat. We've got a presentation coming up. Handouts are available. I'm actually going to do it now because I'm terrible for not doing it. So I'm just pushing those handouts out. They are in the handout area. You can get them as you want and download them. And just to remind you where we are, we're in point 5 or 7, which is now 8, obviously, because we're going to go into a new normal one at the end of these. So if you are interested in any webinars, we've got lots and lots going on. So please do have a look on here. And next up is Lenny. I'm going to let Lenny go there, and I'm just going to upload the PowerPoint as well into the handout area.
So like last time, for those of you that remember, I was in charge of the technology. I am in charge again today, so please bear with me. I had done a load of animation on the slides. Unfortunately, it's not translated across, so it's all going to be a bit much, but we're going to talk it through at pace. And again, I'm going to try and translate what we're talking about for a work context, but also into a more kind of home stuff as well, so that there's some kind of connections between the two. So I'm guessing people kind of have heard of wellbeing and emotional intelligence. Whether we understand them in any great detail, I kind of assumed we were starting from the point of I've kind of heard them, but I might not necessarily know what they mean in terms of their application for me. So because I wanted you to have a handout as well, the slides obviously double up as the handout. So I wanted to go through a kind of definition of both of them. So well-being in its simplest terms is defined as feeling good and functioning well. Really interesting today. Actually, that poll that we've always done is fascinating in terms of if you think about it in a well-being definition. For at least 9 of you, 10 of you that I saw, today is a happy day. So in terms of your well-being, it's good. Now, all joking aside, understanding what's happening around that can be extremely useful, in the same way that understanding when you're in a bad place, what's triggered it and what's put you there is also extremely useful, because the more you understand about yourself, the more you can replicate those circumstances. So, very simply put, well-being is about feeling good and functioning well. So as you can see, I'm not going to patronize you by reading through every slide, but happiness, contentment, enjoyment, engagement. But equally important to that is our functioning in terms of the world. So positive relationships, control over one's life. We talked about the control dartboard and how that can be so important in terms of recognizing what I can and can't do, and sense of purpose. I think that's been quite interesting for the last few months. How much of your purpose has been related to work and actually the structure that provides, and when that's missing, what other purpose have you filled that with, or not, as the case may be, I guess. So we're going to explore these subjects in much more detail, but I just wanted to start with a kind of a bit of an overview, a framework, if you like, of well-being. Well-being and emotional intelligence are not always necessarily put together in terms of topics. I felt there was a natural connection between the two. So if you look at the definition of emotional intelligence is the ability to identify and, I think most importantly, manage one's own emotions as well as the emotions of others. Now, you could argue, well, how does that link to well-being then? Because actually managing my emotions is potentially a separate entity to my health, my activity level, but actually there's a ton of research, and we know this, that the two are intrinsically linked. The more emotionally aware I am, the more emotionally astute I am, not only of what's happening for me, but what's happening with others, potentially the more my well-being is going to benefit. The less aware I am, the more I'm, for want of a better word, sort of at the mercy of my emotional responses. So emotional intelligence is said to include the 3 key skills, which we're going to look at: emotional awareness, which is the ability to identify one's own emotions, the ability to harness those emotions, because sometimes what we deem to be unhelpful emotions can actually be extremely helpful. They can drive things in a different way, and the ability to manage those emotions. So we're going to look at those in a bit more detail. I think the interesting one for me is, and you may have done stuff like this in the past, you may just be very self-aware, whether you're what we might deem a people person. And usually those of us, and I do put myself in that bracket, those of us that are more kind of kinesthetic in terms of our NLP preference, any of you that have done Herman profiles or working styles, people with a please people working style, tend to have a more external focus on emotional intelligence. By that, I mean they tend to be more aware of what other people are thinking or feeling or experiencing, and perhaps slightly less aware of managing their own emotional responses. So for me, it's where are you putting your energy? Is your energy outward facing, in other words, focusing on what other people need and how you can help and support in that? Or are you focusing internally and asking yourself, actually, what's going on for me? How am I managing my emotion? So we'll come on to that as we go through, but it's an interesting one to think about. Am I kind of external or internal in terms of my focus? So I'm wondering if there's any questions, if there's anything anyone would like to pick up on. As we always say, I know there is a little bit of a delay, so happy to just give you a second or two to catch us up. Nice to see that it's sunny in Scotland, Carl. That makes me very happy. Given last time we spoke, it was due to be snowing. So, yeah, that's definitely an improvement.
Bit different, isn't it? A little bit different. So
anything at all anyone wants to pick up on? Make sense? All happy with that? Hello, Stuart. I've just sent you an email, Stu. We're all okay. Andy, not that it matters, but you have frozen. You still look devilishly handsome, and we can still hear you, but just so you know.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of what all this means, then we're going to start off looking at emotional intelligence in a little bit more detail, because I think understanding the emotion stuff is intrinsically linked into well-being. So you know, it's a bit chicken and egg, but we had to start somewhere. So we're going to start with emotional intelligence. So apologies, this is going to look a little bit cluttered. Just bear with me. We're going to talk it through. So in terms of the emotional intelligence relating into well-being, as we've said already, it's about positive mood, high self-esteem, and there is a lot of research around kind of higher levels of emotional intelligence intrinsically associated to those positive moods and higher self-esteem. So in other words, the more self-aware we are, good, bad, and indifferent, the more arguably our emotions are in check, and therefore our well-being tends to flourish and benefit from that. So there's a lot of research around that. You can find research, I'm sure, that suggests it's not linked, but that's not what I'm here for. So we're looking at kind of how understanding your emotions and those of others can improve not just your well-being, but also your connectivity with other people. And he's back. So please do, like I always say, and if you've not been on these webinars before, take this as absolutely permission. Please ask questions, type something in the chat, stick your hand up, tell me to stop, give personal examples. Anything and everything you can do that creates some interactivity from my point of view is fantastic, because the one thing I miss is your smiley faces. So please feel free to challenge, ask questions, stop me, and even if we're on a delay, I will stop and I'll pick up anything that you're asking. So okay, this is the slide that might get a little bit muddled, but it is useful for us to have a look at. So this fundamentally is how kind of emotional intelligence breaks down. And what you can see is there are 4 quadrants. Now, actually, what you've got in a handout is a questionnaire called the Boston questionnaire, which I'll pick up on in a bit more detail in a sec. The Boston questionnaire actually identifies a 5th heading. I won't overcomplicate it by talking you through what that is. You can access it, you can look at it, there's descriptions in there, and we're going to look at the 4 main constituent elements of emotional intelligence. So on the left-hand side, as you look, you've got recognition and regulation. Across the top, you've got self and social. So each of those quadrants sit in relation to the left and right kind of axes, if you like. So if we start probably in the most obvious one, which is the red square, the kind of self-awareness stuff. So it's recognizing and understanding your moods, emotions, drives, as well as their different effects on others. So let me ask you a question, and I'm interested in your response. Are you aware of the point at which you lose your temper? So I'll just give you a minute, because I'm very aware that you're a little bit behind us. So are you personally aware of the point at which you lose your temper?
I think I probably am.
So if you're saying
we got
yes,
it's coming in.
Yep, definitely. Fantastic. I mean, these yeses that we're getting are fundamentally suggesting that we're self-aware. Now, there's a difference between self-aware and the square underneath, which is self-managed. So recognizing our emotional responses is one thing. Regulating and managing those emotional responses potentially is something very different. And you've heard me bang on often enough about the impact of coaching, the power of coaching, and where coaching can be really useful. We talk about triggers, ping points, and if you can identify what that trigger is, and when you get that point at which you flick, the switch flicks, recognizing it and understanding it is really useful, but managing it, you need strategies around. So as you can see here, it talks about the ability to control or redirect disruptive impulses and moods, the propensity to suspend judgment, to think before acting, which is a lovely, lovely idea. Unfortunately, not always tremendously practical, and fundamentally a big part of emotional intelligence sits with mindfulness. The more I can respond rather than react, the more I'm managing that, regulating my emotional responses. In other words, how often do you just click and 2 minutes later you go, that was ridiculous. I'll give you a simple example. Think of the last time you kicked off about something, got angry, got upset, got tearful, got frustrated, but the example of which was yesterday, 2 weeks ago, 3 years ago, whatever it is. But remember that moment. Think of that last time that you got angry about something. When you looked back on how you responded, not the issue, that's a different thing. When you look back on how you responded, 2 hours later, 2 days later, 2 weeks later, were you proud of how you behaved in that moment? Did you shower yourself in glory? Were you articulate and erudite and adult and logical and not proud? Not so much. And it's not about removing these emotions. It's not about saying these responses are not appropriate. They happen. You are a human being. I say this on every one of these webinars I do. We cannot remove, and nor should we, remove our emotional responses. That's what makes us us. That is the human condition. What it's about is actually asking myself, is this A, appropriate to this situation? B, helpful? And C, is this actually going to make me feel better? And there are times, as I've said already, where there's whole days where we can pick a day of going, I'm going to stomp around the place, I'm going to F and Jeff, I'm going to have a miserable day because that's what I want to do. And that's fine. That's absolutely fine. But how long are you going to allow that to impact on your day, your week, your month? And ultimately, what impact will it be having on your well-being? So, yeah, there's a few people talking about some of the recent comings and goings, to coin a joke from Mr. Stanford. Yeah, I mean, and that's the point, as Carl's just alluded to, it doesn't make a difference. You know, the external stuff you're frustrated with, you know, with the best will in the world, us getting angry about it is not going to change it. Does it stop us getting angry? No, because you have a right to be angry. What I would ask yourself, apologies, I may have mentioned this last time. We talk a lot in neurolinguistic programming about cause and effect. I can't remember if I said this to you last time, but I'm going to repeat it anyway. Cause and effect is essentially, am I operating at cause, in other words, something I can change, or am I operating at effect, which is essentially the impact of that problem? So let me give you an example. I don't know. Somebody cuts you up on the motorway and they're gone. Up the road, they're gone. They've shot off. Now, at that point, you have a choice about your response. You can get angry. You can get wound up. You can get frustrated. You can F and Jeff. You can chase them down the motorway if that's what you choose to do. At which point you're operating at effect because that behavior has affected you and you're now responding. Or you can go back to cause and say, actually, what might be the reason for that? Is it possible? I definitely have told you about the dog one. Is it possible they've got an injured dog in the car and they're rushing to get there? Is it possible, I don't know, they're rushing up country to check the eyesight? I don't know. The point is, we all have choices. And the more we can choose our response, the more likely our response will be appropriate. The more we react, the more we're operating for an emotional part of the brain. It's not to say it's not pleasant. It's not to say it's not healthy. It's not to say it's extremely cathartic, because all of those things are true. The question is, how long are you sustaining that behavior for, and at what cost to you and the relationships around you? So the self side of emotional intelligence probably is what most of you know. I would guess your thought is about me. Actually, am I aware of my own emotions? Do I know when I go from happy to sad or angry to upset? Am I able to manage those emotional responses effectively? I mentioned a minute ago the Boston questionnaire, which I'll reference in a bit more detail in a sec. But the Boston questionnaire is a questionnaire whereby you can establish, actually, how good am I at these various things? We're going to ask you as we go through to do a bit of a self-check now. And then it'd be really interesting once you've done the questionnaire, is what you think you're good at actually your strengths or not? So we'll go on to that in a tick. In terms of the other side of the model, the right-hand side as you look, the social awareness and the social skills, this is about the external stuff. So social awareness is the ability to understand the emotional makeup of other people, skilled in treating those people according to their emotional needs. So it's fundamentally empathy and how we connect and empathize with people. The social skills bit is the relationship management stuff. So it's the kind of proficiency around managing relationships, building relationships, common ground, rapport, that kind of thing. So the awareness, again, is kind of, I recognize what's happening for you emotionally. The social skills bit is working with that and actually saying, well, much as I recognize it, what is it you need from me? How can I make this relationship work? What's really interesting is to recognize, if you looked at all of those, if you looked at the left-hand side or the right-hand side, if you were to say, you've literally got to give one of these, you've got to pick. If you were to pick which of these you deem to be your strength, and you had to pick either self or social, I wonder which one you would pick. What do you reckon, Andy? You have to say whether you're stronger at recognizing what's going on for yourself or for others and the relationship stuff. Which would you say?
Probably for others.
Okay. Any evidence to suggest that? What makes you think that? What?
I suppose it's doing a lot of time working with people, training people, developing people. So watching the room and seeing how people are by small cues and things like that. So I don't know.
You identify what you are, self or social? Sorry, Andy, carry on.
I was just going to say, with some of these, I often come out quite balanced.
That's a good thing.
Yeah.
In some ways, it's a good thing. In other ways, it can be a kind of a bit of a difficult one, because that suggests you don't necessarily have a strength or preference, which, as I say, is not necessarily a bad thing. We're going to go on to the polls as we go through, so there might be some kind of scores you can give yourselves there. But have a think about it. If you were to say which of these you deem to be your strength, I know with mine it's social. It's very much other people, and I'm probably fairly self-aware in terms of my emotions. Where my massive black hole is self-management. That's the bit for me that I need to work on. And that's why understanding your emotional intelligence is so helpful in terms of your well-being, because I know when I'm struggling, the self-management stuff is what I struggle with. So if I can have some strategies around that, that's going to help my well-being. See, I know Leah from of old, and definitely, and again, your job determines that to a certain extent. I'm assuming you're still in the same job, but very much if you have an outward facing job, if you're very much about the customer, and there's some real strengths in kind of that social kind of external stuff. The issue is, who manages you? How do you manage yourself? And that's something to be mindful of. So we're going to go through these in a little bit more detail. As I've always said, and I've said it 100 times, if you need to ask a question, if you want me to answer anything, just type it in the chat. I'm keeping up with all of it. So in terms of the self-awareness aspect of emotional intelligence, so we've got emotional awareness. So recognizing one's emotions, and I think this is probably the most important thing, and their effects. And remember, this is about you. This is about self. So it's not about their effects on other people. It's about their effects on you. So if you are the sort of person that once a month needs to go and stand in the middle of a field and scream your head off, because actually that's cathartic and it helps and it's useful for you, there's nothing wrong with that. In other words, if you have what one might deem a negative emotion, but it gives you a positive effect, there's no detriment to that. The question is that negative emotion actually just having a detrimental impact, continuing to have a detrimental impact? Because a big part of this is being aware enough to know your strengths and limitations. Actually, I know that when I get tired, for example, tiredness is a huge trigger for me. Other people get hangry, don't they, when they get hungry and they get angry? What is it? When is it that you operate at your best? But equally, when is it that you operate at your worst? So sureness about one's own self-worth and capabilities. I always think these are quite interesting, these three together, because the last one for me in particular is probably quite jarring. As a coach, very often that's what we're coaching people around: self-worth, self-belief, self-confidence. And they may recognize their emotions and they may know their strengths and limitations, but they may not have a belief that they're good enough or that they're capable enough. So it's interesting that all three of these are kind of lumped together, but that is the self-awareness aspect of emotional intelligence. So emotional awareness, self-assessment, and by that we do mean accurate and truthful, and self-confidence. So if you were to consider a bit of a poll around this one, I think we've got this on a poll, haven't we, Andy? Yeah,
it's up there.
Sorry, mate, you carry on.
It's up there now.
Cool. So what you've got, if you have a look at I'll just talk you through the scoring system. So if you give yourself a score of 17 or above, then that would suggest it's a real strength for you. A score of 13 to 16 suggests there's maybe a little bit of work that needs doing. 12 to 9, or rather 9 to 12, suggests there's probably a bit of an area for concern, and anything under 8, and that would suggest that there's a lot of work required in terms of that being a massive area for improvement. So if you were to kind of give yourself some scores there, we can see a lot of 9 to 12. That's interesting. Bearing in mind 9 to 12, and apologies, maybe we should have given you the definitions before you gave yourself a score. 9 to 12 is kind of very much the lower end. So that suggests that you're perhaps an area that you need or perhaps want to work on. But it looks like what's winning on that one is the kind of 13 to 16 area, which suggests there's a bit of work, but it's certainly something you kind of are aware of. Remember, as I've said already, we're going to have that questionnaire, so you can give yourself a proper score on this one. The question then becomes, well, so what? So I've identified that's an area I need to improve, or it's an area I'm really strong at. So what? What do I do? Well, I can't do much about the area you're strong at. My advice is carry on. Bottle it, sell it to other people. But there are some tips as we get towards the end of the presentation about what I can do to improve areas that I perhaps feel I'm not so strong on. So we are going to go through those. Okay, so next area of kind of the emotional intelligence self bit sits around self-regulation. This is the bit that I said is my kind of area, my Achilles heel. So self-control, managing disruptive emotions and impulses. It's interrupting that pattern of negative automatic thinking. We've talked about a load of models for that. So controlled dartboard is a great way to do that. Actually, am I about to go off on one about something that is just not in my gift to change? You know, Carl's example of getting angry at the kind of politics of what's happening. As she's literally said here, he's literally said it doesn't make one jot of difference. Have the reaction and then apply your controlled dartboard and say, actually, do you know what? I'm putting a lot of energy into this man, which is not helpful for me. And he don't care. It doesn't change anything. So kind of managing and interrupting those impulses is really important. Kind of trustworthiness, honesty and integrity. And by that means being personally responsible. You know, it's so easy to blame other people for those disruptive impulses and emotions. The only way we create an emotion is we create that emotion. We may be responding to something around us, and that very much links to the NLP model that we looked at. So if you can't remember that one or you didn't see that one, go back and have a look, because that's all about actually how am I reacting to the circumstances around me, and is that reaction helpful? I need to be honest with myself here. Actually, am I honestly having a trustworthy response, or am I just blaming everybody else? It says here taking responsibility for personal performance. I also think that's about personal behaviours. You know, actually, if a relationship isn't working, as I've said already, the easiest thing is to blame the other person. But if you blame the other person, you're then powerless, because that then means the only way that relationship can improve is if they do something different. So if that relationship needs to work, if that relationship is of benefit to you, and actually you've got to put yourself out a little bit to make it work, I would argue that's worth thinking about, particularly when we come onto the social bit of emotional intelligence. The last bit of self-regulation is adaptability. So being able to change and flex and kind of move with what it is that's needed around you, rather than kind of being that rigid mindset. I've got a reference later on about a growth versus fixed mindset reference, a lady called Carol Dwecker, I want to say, but it's on a slide. We'll see it later. If you're interested in this kind of particularly around culture change, growth mindset, fascinating, really worth a read. And it's all about how can we culturally, but also how can I individually be more flexible, be able to handle change, and the emotional responses that go with that. So you can probably guess what we got coming now. So you've got self-control, trustworthiness, conscientious. Remember, 0 to 8 is kind of I don't do it. 9 to 12 is, you know, the lower 50%. So bear those in mind when you're doing those polls. So thinking here about self-regulation. So managing your emotional responses, being honest around your part that you're playing rather than blaming other people, being responsible and flexible in terms of change. So if we just have a quick look at that one. Yeah, few or higher on this one. Okay, that's interesting. So I think more people more confident with self-regulation. I think both of the polls so far, okay, we've got 50-50. Yeah, more or less 50-50 actually. Some people saying actually that it's the area, the 9 to 12 area. Be fascinating when you get to do the questionnaire to actually see what your scores are. I'll talk you through that when we get towards the end. So great. Okay, let's move on. So social awareness, we've touched on that already. We talked in terms of emotional intelligence about what it means for you, that kind of internal process, but also now we're looking more external, kind of what others are doing. So empathy, we've talked about, and we talked about empathy on one of the previous slides. So I always think it's interesting when you use a word like sensing, because it's quite a nebulous word, isn't it? Well, I can sense something doesn't mean I'm sensing it right. So, you know, it's about being concerned. It's kind of being interested and kind of being taking an active role in kind of looking to understand other people. In coaching, we work a lot from asking questions, and that's about, I need to understand where you're coming from, because otherwise I only understand where I'm coming from, and that's arguably less helpful. So empathy is a really important skill in terms of social awareness, and something I think to a certain extent you kind of, it's an intuition thing, but it's a bit woolly, isn't it? So we'll come on to look at this in a bit more detail. Developing others, Andy was just saying, a big part of what we do as coaches and trainers is all about kind of the intuition and reading people and what do they need and are they getting it. And that's why for me this kind of lack of being able to see your wonderful faces is kind of a bit perplexing for me, because are you getting it? Are you not? And you only need a tiny look on someone's face to go, there's something not, that it's not quite landing. So it's that ability to kind of sense what other people need and help to bolster that, big part of coaching. Leveraging diversity is a very posh way of saying kind of how we bring various sets of people together. You know, can we create a good, diverse set of people around us, friends, colleagues? Can we work in that diverse kind of environment? I always think that's quite interesting when you've got, in terms of organizations, when you've got teams of planners, teams of people who work in IT, teams of HR advisors, teams of social workers, there's it's difficult then to have that diverse kind of work across. We tend to work down rather than perhaps across. So how do you, if you're working in organizations, how do you create an environment where diversity can be kind of cultivated? Anyway, rhetorical question. Political awareness, so reading groups, kind of emotionally, being able to, there's a fascinating piece of research we talk about in training. When I did my trainer training, we get told there's a rapport leader. So when you walk into a classroom full of people or a room full of people, there's usually someone, and it may not be the most obvious person, who's in charge of the rapport of the group. So next time you're in an environment where you're in a room full of people, meeting socially or kind of work-wise, just watch what people do. What you'll tend to find is one person will, for example, cross their legs, and subconsciously people around the room kind of copy that person. So what's really powerful from a training perspective, and I would argue from a leadership perspective and just an effective relationship perspective, is if you can match with the rapport leader, if you can spot who it is, and you can start matching them, eventually what you can do is start taking over that rapport leader role, which is great for kind of establishing relationships. So I would argue someone who's kind of socially intuitive is able to go, ask the person, how do I match them? Not compete with them, because that's not going to be helpful. How do I match them in such a way that is not threatening? And then how do I start to get some of that kind of control? It's kind of very politely named political awareness. I would argue it's about kind of influencing, essentially, who's the boss in this room and how do I become the boss in this room. So again, a little poll around this one. We'll go forward and then I'll go back and remind you of the scoring. So we've got kind of the scoring again. Let me just remind you of the topics, which is empathy, kind of understanding others, developing others, so sensing or understanding what other people need. Leveraging diversity, so that's about kind of how you work with people with different mindsets, different cultural backgrounds, different views on things, and that political awareness, kind of reading the currents of a whole group and kind of power within those groups. And remember, the scores are 0 to 9, kind of lower score. Anything under 13 is your kind of half end, and then we've got kind of, anything from 0 to 12 is your kind of lower 50%, and anything over that is your top 50%. So do we have that open? Let's see what we got. Again, okay, that's really interesting. Some people, this is the first time, I think we've seen maybe 1 or 2. This is the first time I'm seeing scores, big scores over 16. So people who consider this to be a real strength. Again, I do think your job has a big part to play in that, for those of you that are in work. Okay, so the last of our 4 key areas then, this one sits around social skills. So we've talked about kind of social awareness, which is one thing, but having the skill set to kind of manage what you're aware of is another thing entirely. So influencing skills, I think personally, I would argue this is one of the most important social skills, because it's about how do I think we talked about this last time, excuse me, managers often say to me, I just need to get them to do something. I just need to persuade them to do something. I always think that's fascinating language. I always think influencing is far more useful. If you look at the dictionary definition of persuading someone is to get them to do something they don't want to do. Influencing them is to get them to want to do it in the first place. So for me, the key social skill is, how do I get you to want to do something? And that sits in organizational change. That's about relationships. And by that, I mean kind of, relationships. It's about family relationships, because if you have to persuade someone, you're pushing them. If you can influence them, it's a very different skill. I would argue this is one of the most effective skills to have. So communication, clear and concise and convincing messages, which you can't do if you haven't been able to influence someone. Chances are you're trying to push information into them. Initiating or managing change, so the ability to kind of act as a catalyst for change. I think this is fascinating. These last two I think are really important. Kind of negotiating and resolving disagreements. When you come to do the Boston questionnaire, there's a question on there that says, are you the kind of arbitrator? Anyway, that word, in your family, when there's kind of family disputes, do you find yourself often the one who's kind of trying to negotiate everyone's position? And I think that's a fascinating one. I would argue if you can manage conflict in a family, you can manage conflict anywhere, because families, by definition, no one can attack anyone like an internal family member. It is unbelievable the amount, but that's what families do. So again, from a managerial leadership point of view, being able to kind of negotiate and resolve disagreements effectively is really, really important. And again, nurturing, beneficial and instrumental relationships. How do I get the best out of someone? And the more intuitively and aware I am in terms of what's happening for them, I would argue the more effective that's going to be. So last poll on this one anyway. Again, think about your scoring. Anything under 13 is lower, 50%. Anything over that, I would argue, is higher, 50%. Just to remind you of the topic heading. So we've got influence, communication, change, the ability to kind of initiate or manage change. Managing conflict, that's a big one, huge one. Managing conflict for others. Remember, this is negotiating or resolving disagreements around you. It might not be a conflict that you're involved with, and that's quite interesting. Sometimes we find it easier to manage conflict when it doesn't relate to us, because we can be emotionally distant from it. And building bonds, those kind of nurturing relationships. So let's have a quick look and see what we've got on this one. Again, pretty consistent. It's fascinating, actually. We've got almost consistently the same scores in each of these boxes throughout all these polls. So just remind me, Andy, do we share the poll results with people afterwards?
We have, but we can. There's not a problem.
I mean, what might be useful for your own kind of reflection is kind of trying to remember what scores you gave yourself. And then once you've done the questionnaire, actually do the two marry up. Because a big part of emotional intelligence is being self-aware. So actually what score I'm giving myself here and now while I'm sitting here versus what my actual score is may not necessarily be the same thing. So worth kind of bearing in mind. So we've done the poll on that one. So in terms of all of this stuff, knowing it is great, and you've been quite honest, hopefully, no reason not to be, about what you consider your score to be, where you think your strengths might be, and where some areas for improvement might be. If you have identified that actually there are some areas that I want to improve on, then of course, understandably, the next question to me is, well, how? What do I do? How do I improve my emotional intelligence, or indeed my well-being? Actually, how do I connect those two together? So in terms of emotional intelligence, then, we've said already one of the big ones is to respond rather than react. And in order to respond, you need to understand. So if you're responding to something without the facts, with half the information, with not a kind of thought through process, chances are you're reacting. So again, probably have mentioned this to you before, two sides of the brain we know, left and right hemisphere, one responsible for kind of logic and structure and kind of arguably a more adult response, and the other side of our brain is our emotion, arguably our child response. When we're reacting, we're tending to react emotionally. So we're operating from that child kind of that emotional, unfettered kind of response. When we're responding, we're asking questions, we're seeking to understand, we're applying control dartboard, because all of those make us have to think through our response rather than just react to that. So listening with patience is an interesting one. It's a skill I'm not tremendously good at, which I have to say is an area certainly for me to improve on. I tend to listen until there's a pause and then I talk. So listening with patience is about, again, just acknowledging that the other person may not share the same view as you. They may have a completely different mindset from you. But it's that whole seeking to understand stuff. Actually, I need to let them say what they need to say, because there's nothing worse than being shut down. So listening, being sure to understand what it is, asking questions. Actually, have I understood this? Is this what you mean? So again, am I right in thinking, Andy, we've done a bit on coaching? I honestly can't remember. I'm losing track.
Coaching. No.
Did we not? Okay. Well, fundamentally, coaching, the key skill in coaching is questions. And we ask questions in coaching because we seek to understand. So it's not dissimilar in what one would do in any normal relationship. It's about actually the more questions I ask you, the more I can understand where you're coming from. I've got another presentation, actually, which I'll send to you, Andy, if you want to stick it on. I don't know how we can circulate it, but it is a really simple PowerPoint presentation around conversational coaching, how to use some of these techniques to bring out from somebody else what you need to understand about them, but doing it in a way that is helpful and informative and helps you to listen with patience, which really links to the next one. It's that look at the whole picture. Big part of that is being self-aware and honest enough to go, actually, what part am I playing in this? Maybe I push this person's buttons just as much as they push mine. Unlikely, I'm sure, in a lot of your cases. But, again, the more you can be kind of honest about what you're doing, the more you can manage it. The more you just say it's all down to them, you're relying on them. So actually, what is the whole picture here? Sorry, mate, carry on.
I was just going to say I may have done that in a couple of roles, have deliberately pushed people's buttons to the point that one senior manager at one council actually got up and I thought he was going to punch me. That's how much.
The question for me is, for what purpose?
Oh, because he was annoying and I thought, well, let's annoy him.
Ultimately, this is fascinating. Look at the very last statement on that slide, Mr. Sanford. Isn't that fascinating?
That made me happy.
Or do you want to be happy? Made you happy, absolutely. But actually, at what cost? So if that, and I'm sure it wasn't, but if that senior manager was a decision maker, actually, was that the best thing to do in that moment?
It was serving to highlight a problem in the project. It wasn't just completely juvenile, but it was completely mindful in the way it was done.
So you were making a response rather than a reaction.
Yeah.
So in terms of going through the checklist, yes, the end outcome may have been one of a combative nature, but ultimately, for what purpose? There's nothing wrong. I challenge in organizations all the time. That's a big part of our role, as you know, to rattle cages and to kind of ask the difficult questions. But for what purpose? Well, for me, the purpose of that is if it's not done, we're not going to get the outcomes that we need to get done. So as long as it's done in a way that somebody doesn't lump you on or kind of get really offended or upset, I think that's the skill. Being able to challenge constructively is a good skill, I would argue. Yeah,
it was, and part of it was done to surface the way this person was acting behind closed doors to other people in front of the right people.
There you go. And that's the main thing. I think that last statement is absolutely the amount of times in my head in a day I'll say, am I right here or am I just making myself miserable? Sometimes we just get into an argument because we want to prove a point, or we just take on a course of action because we want to prove that we can. And actually, is it making you happy? If it makes you happy, then you're right and happy, and that's wonderful. If you're right and unhappy, who bloody cares? Why not just let it go? Why not let the other person have their victory? Why not let the other person think, well, I've bested them? Because ultimately, if it makes you unhappy, if it makes you, and this is my point about losing work, if as a result of that reaction, you lost a contract, well, it's not worth being right in that instance, is it? It's worth being financially stable in that instance. So it's all for what purpose, for what reason am I doing this? What is the outcome I'm looking for here? And at what cost to me in terms of getting that outcome? So ask yourself, am I making myself happy here, or am I just seeking to be right? Human condition. There is a lot around well-being, and I know I've focused predominantly on emotional intelligence because there's a ton of stuff around well-being, and particularly at the moment, for completely understandable reasons. The reference here, 5 Ways to Wellbeing, is an NHS piece of research. It's linked to the Mind Mental Health Charity, and they say there are 5 key ways in which we can improve and build upon our well-being. So connection, and again, if you think about the current climate, actually, how are you connecting? Who are you connecting to? And is that lack of connection having an impact on you? Because now you have one of 2 choices. You can say, yes, it's having an impact on me, and sit back and let it have its impact. Or you can recognize it's having that impact and ask yourself, what can I do to change it? You and I were talking earlier, Andy, about let's get together, but let's sit at the end of the garden. You sit over there, I'll sit over here. We'll be 10 foot apart if we need to be. Now, that's a connection. That face-to-face conversation is a different one from, much as these kind of, electronic versions of things are really useful, they do miss that connectivity. So, how are you connecting? Who are you connecting with? Remember last time we talked about sharks and dolphins? Who are you swimming with? Are you swimming with people that are uplifting and are bringing your mood up? Or are you associating with people that are having the opposite impact? Be active. I always think I lose a bit of credibility on this one because
me too.
Yeah. Unfortunately, you can only see me from the waist. I'm actually a size 8 underneath here, but you just can't see it. Active to what extent? And I think for what purpose? Again, you remember me saying to you, I'd shared with you that one of the first things I did as soon as we entered lockdown is to give myself 2 tasks, one work task and one home task that I was going to do every day. Otherwise, the time would be wasted. So it may not be active. I'm not running marathons. I'm not climbing mountains, but I am active in terms of my engagement with my life and kind of making things happen rather than just waiting. So, your definition of active is down to you on a personal level. Seek to learn. This is a big piece of learning for me. And although I can honestly say I haven't come out of it, or I will not come out of it, I don't think all my courses are now going to be electronic. What I do know is I can do it. And that's a huge piece of learning for me. So, what have you learned? What have you learned about yourself during this period of time? Remember last time we talked about what you follow the phrase I am with becomes your reality. I am adaptable. I've learned that. I am able to do things in a different way. It may not be my choice. It may not be my preference, but I am absolutely able to do it. Give of yourself. I think that's an important one. Not just give as in financially or kind of even your time or volunteering. Cycling, someone said, absolutely. I know a lot of friends swear by cycling. I always get a bit worried that I get my foot stuck in a clip and kind of do that kind of slow bang, which I'm sure you have done at some point or another, Carl. It's whatever floats your boat, but managing your state in terms of the activity is really important. And I think giving as well. I think I mentioned to you last time, my wife is working on a volunteer kind of coordinator role in terms of what's happening locally. And the amount people give for absolutely no return whatsoever, it's just blown my mind. It doesn't have to be volunteering. It could be give of your time, give of your advice, give of your laughter. I'm a huge believer in the power of kind of having a laugh, and just enjoying being with people. And when I don't feel like that, I shut myself away. But when I do, I want to give of myself. I want people to enjoy being in my company. So giving doesn't have to be a financial or a time thing. It's giving of you, letting people connect with you. It's really important. This is probably the biggest one. Be in the present, be in the moment. That little phrase at the bottom that I've put there, depression tends to be past orientation. So if you're finding yourself sad and upset and even angry, chances are there's something that's gone on that you're thinking about. If you're anxious, it's likely that you're anxious about what's going to be happening. If you apply to use control dartboard to both of those, you can't change the past and you can't change the future, but you can influence how you respond to those things. So one of the things in terms of your reactions, those of you that I asked, do you know when you're getting angry? Ask yourself if you can interrupt that thinking. Am I getting angry in the present? In which case, fine, crack on. Am I dragging up something this person's done years, months, weeks ago? In which case I'm living in the past orientation. Or am I predicting something they haven't even done yet? So, live your emotions in the moment. Be in the present. Be responsible for the present. The past is gone and you cannot change it. And the future is undetermined. What you can absolutely control is how you're reacting in that moment. Not easy, but it's something we should be doing. So in terms of little tips and tricks, I'm a strong believer in accepting your emotions. If you're in a bad mood, be in a bad mood. Don't beat yourself up about it. Don't feel bad about it. At the end of the day, we have moods for a reason. There's a really, how do we know that it's what it's like to be really sunny? Because we know what it's like when it's really cold. How do we know what it's like for, glorious sunshine? Because we know what it's like when it's peeing it down with rain. You have to have light and shade. You have to have moods. It is what it is. The more you beat yourself up over it, the harder it is. What I would absolutely advocate is, how long are you going to live in that emotion? So live in the present, we've talked about that already. One of the big things we've talked about over the whole series of these workshops, actually, is kind of that internal dialogue, that devil on your shoulder, that little voice in your head. What is that little devil saying, or angel saying? What is your kind of internal dialogue, and at what cost to you? So now, 5 into these, my dialogue on the first one of these was, I'm going to blow the internet up. It's all going to go horribly wrong. I won't know what I'm doing. I'll F and Jeff, and people will kind of disconnect with me. And, as I've gone on, that internal dialogue is completely different now. Now what I'm interested in is that you get a good experience and you get something positive out of it. And that's not that wasn't always important, but my internal dialogue has changed. Excuse me, and is much more helpful for me. So choose your state. I think I may have shared this with you, but this is very much the NLP model. There's a phrase with neurolinguistic programming that says, choose what mood you're going to be in. When I first did my NLP training, I wanted to put choose your state as a reminder somewhere where I saw it every day. So on the back of my front door, as you open the door, so facing me, was a choose your state. Literally said choose your state. And as I walked out the door, I decided what mood I was going to be in for that day. It's a really, really useful technique to get used to, because actually, what are you telling yourself today is going to be? There's one later on that says start your day well. Do you wake up in the morning and go, oh God, because then that's the day you're going to have? Or do you start the day by saying today is going to be whatever it's going to be, sunny, productive, interesting, useful, whatever it is. So we talked a lot about this when we talked about kind of self-motivation, which we did last time. For those of you that weren't able to join us, definitely worth a look. Look at yourself. That's about being honest with yourself. I think most people would say, well, I'm pretty good at that. The questionnaire will help you to identify that. Actually, are you self-aware, and do you regulate those emotions? So actually, what am I here? What part am I playing? What contribution am I making? Good, bad, and indifferent. Determine and live your personal values. We've definitely talked about this at some point over these workshops, because the bit I suggested you ask yourself is, for what purpose for me? So I don't know, I pick out a personal one. I like my friends to feel welcome when they come to my house. That's a value for me. So for what purpose for me? Because I want people to feel comfortable and relaxed and happy to be in my company. So although I'm creating an environment that's about how they're feeling, there's an inherent kickback for me, which is I feel good about that environment I'm creating. So actually, what is it that you're doing, and the purpose behind it for you, most importantly? Apologies, sorry. Identify your strengths. We are so good at telling ourselves what we're not good at. I do wonder if it's a bit of the British condition, is kind of humility, and we can't be seen as being boastful or kind of arrogant, or so we kind of go the other way. You don't have to go around talking about them to everybody, but what are you good at? What are your strengths? Where are the areas that you consider yourself to be kind of positive in? There's a really interesting little activity you can do called the Wheel of Life. If you literally kind of go on the Google and the Google Wheel of Life, it's kind of a wheel that breaks down into sections, and it allows you to kind of say, well, actually, what am I, so we've got things like health, we've got things like wealth, we've got things like well-being, and you sort of give yourself a score around it, and it could be quite a useful tracker actually to see where the differences are and where you were to perhaps where you've ended up. And this last one is me. I just thought I'd chuck that in. I like a bit of a laugh. Now, maybe that's just me. I like humour. I think we know that humour releases endorphins. There's nothing like a good laugh. I think you'll all agree with that. So, actually, when's the last time you had a real proper belly laugh? And if not, what makes you laugh? What makes you happy? And just connect with it, because ultimately, your well-being is your responsibility. It's nobody else's. And I know that sounds a bit harsh and it sounds a bit kind of uncaring. And any of you that know me will know that's the polar opposite of what I am, very much about caring and looking after people, probably to my detriment. But ultimately, I can't be responsible for your happiness, your well-being, your emotional response. Only you can be responsible for those things. So kind of, you know, what is it? What is good about you? What is not so good about you? What would you like to do differently? In terms of some, sorry, Andy, have I interrupted you again there, mate?
No, you carry on. I was just nodding.
In terms of some further information, so what do we already have attached? Well, we've got some handouts, which Andy's referenced. So there's a couple of documents about well-being. So there's the kind of 5 ways to well-being stuff, very technical term, from the NHS, but there's also some references in there. We've got the Boston questionnaire. Now, some of you might be wondering where that comes from. Very often when things are labelled Boston questionnaire, Cambridge this, Oxford that, we tend to assume it's a university thing. And that must be, you know, some academic has thought that up. Actually, the Boston Emotional Intelligence questionnaire comes from the Boston Police Force, believe it or not. The Boston Police Force were getting a lot of complaints, not just about their external customer relation, but also how they treated each other internally. So they realised, and we know this was in the 70s, so this is a while ago, but they realised that there was a lack of emotional intelligence. The processes they were following very well. What they weren't doing is showing a great deal of empathy. They weren't trying to understand people. They were doing things very much by the book. What we now know is that emotional intelligence has as much, if not more significant impact on people's development than actual IQ type intelligence. So definitely worth having a look at that questionnaire. It's about 20 questions, I think. No, it's more than that. Anyway, take you about 10 minutes of your life. You know, we've all got a bit of time on our hands, hopefully, at the moment, especially now you're not homeschooling, just to pick up on that one. So have a look through it. You've also got the emotional intelligence competencies there. So some of the stuff we talked about into more detail. So you've got plenty there in terms of the handouts. Have a look. Obviously, if there's anything else you want, let me know. If you're a reader, Daniel Goleman's Big Idea. Daniel Goleman is one of the founding fathers of emotional intelligence. If you look up EI, is the first name that will pop up. So the one I like is the Big Idea Emotional Intelligence book. You've got the 5 Ways to Wellbeing, which we've talked about already. So that's kind of NHS guidelines around connecting and being active and learning. Mindfulness is a huge kind of connection with well-being in particular. So actually, remember we talked about being grateful and kind of acknowledging what's worked and what's good. There's a ton of research that says actually that's about rewiring our brains and getting away from that negative automatic thinking. Mind Mental Health Charity, there's a ton of research there that they've done. Growth Mindset, it was Carol Dweck. Crikey, I'm surprised I remembered that. Growth Mindset, again, if you're a reader, really worth having a look at. Fixed Mindset is kind of this is how it is, this is life, this is the way. Growth Mindset is very much NLP, very linked to kind of the internal dialogue we use with each other. So I know quite a few of you have contacted Andy and I to ask for further stuff and found that really interesting. What next? What next for me? Growth mindset, if nothing else, if you take nothing else for further research, look at the growth mindset stuff. And then you've obviously got the kind of mental health online resources and bits and bobs. So that was an absolute whistle-stop tour. We would not normally do either of those topics in an hour, let alone both of them. So hopefully that's been a little bit of a kind of piqued your interest. As ever, obviously appreciate you guys being here. Thank you for giving up your time. I think we had 28 of you today, so that's brilliant. We've gone a bit up and down of late, so I know straight after a bank holiday weekend can be a bit tricky. So thank you for that. Please do leave us some feedback if you want to connect. We're both on LinkedIn. We're happy to kind of make any connections. I'm going to sign off and ask Andy just to finish us off. And remember, in 2 weeks' time, we've got goal setting, I think. So that's our next topic.
You always leave me with that one, don't you?
Really
try and remember. Did I put it in at the end this time?
You did.
I did. Setting goals for productivity. So that's the next one up, folks. As ever, thank you, Lenny. That's been brilliant. And we'll look forward to seeing you all soon. Some of you that have attended this one asked for a webinar on Microsoft Teams. So I am in the process of getting a couple of experts to come and talk about how you as organizations can get more out of Microsoft Teams, because lots of organizations have suddenly been given it as the solution and are now rapidly trying to work out what problems it helps with. So having a couple of people that have leveraged it well, hopefully will help. So we'll have a webinar on that. And again, that's thanks to you guys coming on here and giving the feedback and responding to us and anything like that. If there are topics you'd like to see Lenny do, or us source experts to get, that would be brilliant. So thank you all, and see you next time.
Bye, guys. Take care.
Bye.